I still remember the smell of sawdust in my father's workshop, the rhythm of his hammer against wood, and the way the late afternoon sun hit his tired face. My father, Thomas Watkins, had nothing when he was born, and for most of my childhood, it seemed like the world never gave him a break. He worked every day from dawn to dusk, laying bricks, carrying timber, mixing concrete, sometimes for pay and sometimes for scraps or favours. He never complained. Even when his hands were raw and bleeding, he smiled for me. He wanted me to understand that life is measured by perseverance and integrity, not luck or inheritance. I watched him closely and absorbed every lesson: how he treated people fairly, how he counted every penny, how he never compromised his honesty, even when others mocked him or cheated him. I was 12 when I realized the truth. My father's life was not just hard, it was heroic. He had built a construction company from nothing. Every brick, every home, every contract he won had been fought for with sweat and faith. He saved rigorously, invested smartly, and with patience, slowly turned our modest existence into something remarkable. By the time I was in middle school, our small house had grown into a proper home, with a yard that smelled of fresh pine and the promise of security. Then my mother died. I was young, but I understood loss even then. After her passing, my father met Margaret. She had a charm that seemed impossible to resist. Soft-spoken, elegant, always knowing the right thing to say. For a while I trusted her. I wanted to. I wanted a mother. Someone to fill the silence my own mother had left behind. But things began to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly. Margaret's advice turned into manipulation. She convinced my father to invest in projects that benefited her friends and relatives more than our family. She whispered doubts about me, my maturity, my capability, planting seeds of distrust in my father's mind. And Noah, my half-brother, began to listen more to her than to the father who had raised him with love. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that she wasn't capable of the kind of betrayal I felt creeping in. But I was wrong. By the time my father's health started failing, Margaret had slowly taken control of the company he had built from nothing. She softened him with charm, flattered him with compliments, and poisoned his trust in me. The man who had carried the world on his shoulders could barely lift a hammer, and I watched in silence, helpless, as the foundation he had built in every sense began to crumble. Then the day came. My father passed suddenly one stormy night. I found myself standing in the living room of the house he had made, a house that now felt empty and cold. And that's when I saw it. The will. Margaret and Noah had rewritten it. I, the daughter who had watched my father build an empire with my own eyes, had been left with nothing but a watch that belonged to my mother, and a photograph I clung to like a lifeline. Everything else, the house, the company, the money, was gone. I wandered the streets for days. Friends I thought I could trust disappeared, neighbours whispered, and strangers pitied me. But pity doesn't put food on your plate, and tears don't pay rent. I had lost everything. My father, my home, my family. And yet something inside me refused to break. I promised myself then that I would not remain helpless. Not forever. The first few months were the hardest. I took whatever jobs I could find. Waitress, delivery girl, office assistant. Anything to survive. I slept in apartments I could barely afford, ate meals I didn't enjoy, and kept my grief hidden behind a mask of composure. Every night, I held my mother's photograph and thought about the father I had loved and the injustice that had been done. I swore that someday I would rise again, not as the girl they had tried to erase, but as someone stronger, someone unstoppable. The first year, after losing everything, was a blur. I remember walking the streets of Ashburn, the cold biting through my thin coat, and wondering how a person could fall so far so fast. The people who once smiled at me, who nodded politely to my father, now avoided my gaze. I learned quickly that the world doesn't owe you kindness, and sometimes the only person who can fight for you is yourself. I took odd jobs, anything that paid enough to survive. I served coffee in a cafe where the customers sneered, thinking I was too proud to work. I delivered packages, cleaned offices, and sometimes waited tables in restaurants where the tips barely covered a bus ride home. Each job felt like a reminder of my failure, but every paycheck I saved became a brick in the foundation of my revenge. I wasn't content with mere survival. I needed power, knowledge, and strategy. Money alone wouldn't win me justice. I had to understand the game that had been played against me. At night, after work, I studied. I enrolled in online courses in business, finance, and law. I pored over case studies of corporate takeovers, bankruptcies, and mergers. I learned to read contracts, understand investments, and think like the people who had stolen everything from me. It was during this time that I met Claire. She was older, sharp-eyed, and had a presence that commanded respect. Claire recognized the fire in me and offered mentorship, quietly investing in my early business ventures. She never asked for glory, only that I use the knowledge and resources wisely. Claire taught me how to move silently, like a shadow, how to let patience sharpen every decision, and how to make people underestimate you until it was too late. Years passed, and I transformed. The girl who once wandered homeless through Ashburn had become Eleanor Ward, a poised, composed, and intelligent investor with a growing reputation for strategic acquisitions. I kept my identity hidden. No one could suspect that this powerful woman, this boardroom force, was the same girl who had once been erased from her own family's legacy. I returned to Ashburn quietly, making small investments at first. I watched Margaret, noting her decisions, her weaknesses, and the people who surrounded her. The company my father had built was in her hands, but she had neither the vision nor the integrity to maintain it. Slowly, piece by piece, I began acquiring shares, quietly positioning myself to gain control from within. It wasn't just about money. It was about understanding. Every legal loophole Margaret had exploited, every unethical decision she had made, became ammunition in my arsenal. I formed alliances with board members who had been ignored or mistreated, investors who had long resented Margaret's arrogance, and employees who remembered my father fondly. All of them were pieces of the puzzle, moving quietly until the day the final picture would be revealed. During those years, I also reflected on myself. I had changed, yes, but not entirely for the worse. I had learned patience, restraint, and the art of timing. Revenge is not about rushing, it's about preparation, precision, and letting the people who wronged you believe they are safe until it's too late. And Margaret, blinded by her own greed, thought she was untouchable. The hardest part was Noah, my half-brother. Once my ally, once someone I had trusted, he had chosen silence over loyalty. I remembered the small moments, the shared laughter, the fleeting glimpses of kindness he had shown me as a child. But he had followed Margaret's influence, standing by as I was stripped away. I didn't forget. I would never forget. But vengeance requires patience. I reminded myself every night, as I pored over contracts and spreadsheets, as I negotiated quietly with investors. I am not seeking petty satisfaction. I am reclaiming what was stolen. I am honoring my father's legacy. Every decision I made, every calculated step, brought me closer to the moment when I would stand in the mansion that once belonged to us and let the truth speak louder than anger. By the time I was ready to return openly to Ashburn, I was not the girl who had fled with only a wristwatch and a photograph. I was Eleanor Ward, a force to be reckoned with, calm, intelligent, and unyielding. I returned not with shouts or threats, but with quiet power. I bought controlling shares, formed alliances, and waited for the day Margaret's empire would crumble, not by my hand directly, but by the consequences of her own actions and my careful orchestration. And still, even with all the planning, I remembered my father. I remembered how he had built everything from nothing, how he had taught me to value integrity, and how he had always reminded me that true power is not about wealth alone, but about dignity, patience, and courage. Every move I made was in honor of him, and every step I took brought me closer to the reckoning that awaited. Returning to Ashburn under the name Eleanor Ward felt surreal. The town hadn't changed much. The same streets, the same buildings, the same whispers. But I had. I was no longer the powerless girl who had been cast out. I was someone they couldn't ignore. Someone who had learned how to move silently, yet strike decisively. Margaret was still the same. Arrogant, overconfident, believing she had secured the company my father had built. She had grown fat on her ill-gotten gains, surrounded by yes men who flattered her and board members too afraid to challenge her. But I knew the cracks in her armor, the insecurities she hid beneath her polished exterior, and the alliances she thought she had secured. Every decision she had made to enrich herself, every cut corner, every dishonest maneuver, they were all pieces of her undoing. I began quietly. Small acquisitions, subtle alliances, behind-the-scenes conversations. I didn't want her to see me coming. I wanted her to feel safe, to bask in her own arrogance. People underestimated me because they saw Eleanor Ward as polite, reserved, almost invisible. That invisibility was my weapon. While she underestimated me, I was building my position quietly, every step precise, every move deliberate. The first domino fell when I approached a few disgruntled board members. They remembered my father, remembered the fairness and integrity he had once shown them. They also remembered the injustice of Margaret's takeover. I reminded them of that history, of how she had manipulated my father, and how they had all been complicit in silence. Slowly, one by one, they pledged their loyalty. Then I moved to the shareholders. I approached investors Margaret had ignored, those she had thought too small to matter. I presented a vision of stability, transparency, and profitability, something she had never truly cared about. They saw sense, they saw opportunity, and they joined me. Every small step shifted the balance, eroding Margaret's control without her ever realizing the scale of the threat. Noah was the most difficult. Seeing him, grown but still timid, filled me with conflicting emotions: anger, betrayal, and a strange twinge of sorrow. He had once been my ally, my confidant, and he had chosen Margaret over me. Yet even as I plotted revenge, I knew he was still human, still capable of remorse, still capable of regret. But that regret would come too late. My first public move was subtle, but devastating. I called a meeting of the board under the pretense of discussing new investments. At that meeting, I revealed documents, contracts, and financial discrepancies that exposed Margaret's poor management and unethical decisions. The room went silent. Shock spread across the faces of the board members who had once bowed to her every whim. Margaret's smile faltered. She tried to dismiss me, tried to charm and manipulate, but it was too late. The pieces had been set in motion. As the days passed, Margaret's empire began to crumble. Vendors pulled contracts, investors withdrew support, and employees who had once feared her now quietly aligned with me. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The destruction of her control was satisfying enough. Every collapse, every lost contract, every boardroom betrayal was a lesson she had created herself. Throughout it all, I maintained my calm. I walked the streets of Ashburn like a shadow, observing, learning, waiting for the moment when Margaret and Noah would finally understand the scale of their mistake. The mansion my father had built, once a symbol of family and love, had become a monument to betrayal. I knew that when the reckoning came, it would be there, where it all had begun. One night, I confronted Noah privately. His eyes widened when he realized who I was. There was fear, yes, but also shame. He stammered apologies, pleaded for understanding, tried to explain his choices. I listened quietly. Part of me ached for the boy I had known, the brother I had loved. But I remembered everything. The manipulation, the betrayal, the years of silence while I was cast aside. This was not the time for mercy. Instead, I gave him a warning. "You have a choice," I said softly. "But remember, some lessons are learned too late. Don't make this harder than it has to be." He nodded, trembling, understanding that his redemption was limited, that the consequences of his actions were inescapable. The final confrontation with Margaret came in the mansion. I walked through the familiar halls, each step echoing memories of my father's laughter, his hard work, and the love that had once filled this place. Margaret stood before me, a picture of defiance and fear. She tried to manipulate, to charm, to threaten. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak more than necessary. I let the evidence speak for itself. Contracts, legal documents, financial statements, all proving her greed, corruption, and betrayal. Margaret realized finally that she had lost everything. Not because I had taken it from her, but because she had built her empire on lies, manipulation, and greed. The board removed her, investors withdrew, and the mansion, once a fortress of her power, became hollow and silent. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. The satisfaction was quiet, profound, and complete. Revenge had been patient, precise, and inevitable. Margaret had created the circumstances, and I had merely allowed the consequences to unfold. Standing in the grand hall of the mansion my father had built, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. Every corner, every shadow, every creaking floorboard reminded me of what had been stolen from me. Not just money, but trust, family, and years of my life. Yet here I was, Eleanor Ward, the same girl who had left Ashburn with nothing but a wristwatch and a photograph, now reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Margaret's presence was suffocating. She had always commanded attention, but now her confidence had crumbled. She tried to speak, tried to manipulate, but I had already learned to see through her words. Every lie she had ever told, every deceitful maneuver she had executed, was now laid bare. I let her realize it herself, because nothing cuts deeper than the truth reflected in your own eyes. Noah was there too, standing silently in the corner. The boy I had loved as a brother, now a man shaped by cowardice and influence, looked at me with fear and regret. I remembered our childhood, the small adventures we shared, the promises of loyalty we had whispered in the dark. But all that had been overshadowed by years of betrayal. My heart ached, yes, but my purpose was unwavering. You both had your choices, I said quietly. You could have honored my father's legacy. You could have protected it, respected it, but you didn't. And now, you must live with the consequences. Margaret's face contorted with anger and disbelief. She had underestimated me for years, believing I was powerless, naive, and incapable. I had let her think that. I had let her enjoy every false victory. But every move she had made had been recorded, analyzed, and countered. Every contract, every unethical decision, every manipulation she had orchestrated came back to her in full force. The board had already voted her out. Investors withdrew. Employees she had treated with disdain now quietly aligned with me. Her empire crumbled around her, not with violence, but with the weight of justice she had refused to recognize. Noah approached me, his voice trembling. Ellie, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't. I held up my hand to stop him. Noah, you had the chance to do what was right. You chose silence. You chose greed. I can forgive, but I cannot forget, and some lessons are learned too late. He nodded, tears welling in his eyes, realizing that his actions, or inaction, had consequences that could not be undone. I didn't need him to beg for forgiveness. What mattered was that he understood, finally, the cost of betrayal. Margaret, on the other hand, was left with nothing. Her pride shattered, her influence gone, her empire dismantled. She had spent years building walls around herself, believing she was untouchable. And yet, in the end, it was her own actions that led to her downfall. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. The satisfaction came from knowing that justice had been served, not by my hands directly, but by the inevitable collapse of deceit. I walked through the mansion, feeling the weight of my father's presence in every room. This place, once a symbol of betrayal, now belonged to me, not just as property, but as a testament to patience, perseverance, and resilience. I had reclaimed my inheritance, yes, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my dignity, my father's legacy, and the respect of the town. I thought about the years I had lost, the nights I had cried over what was stolen, and the countless hours I had spent planning, learning, and waiting. It had been worth it. Not for revenge alone, but for justice, for closure, and for honoring the man who had taught me that integrity is more powerful than money, and courage more enduring than fear. In the end, Margaret and Noah were forced to confront their own failures. One could rebuild, one could learn, but neither would forget the lesson. And I walked away, not with hatred, but with a sense of peace. The ashes of betrayal were behind me, and the future stretched ahead, filled with possibility, strength, and the quiet satisfaction of a promise fulfilled.